Here we are for AAPS's Cannabis 360 conference. I'm Imran Rashid with Next Leaf Solutions, and in front of me is Aaron Godin and Eric Akbar. We're going to be going over cannabis extraction, specifically on contamination and remediation processes. So Aaron and Eric, if you guys would one by one, just take a quick introduction of yourselves. Say hi to the audience.
Hey everybody, thanks Imran. My name's Aaron. I'm co-founder of AGMS Solutions Inc. We provide start-to-end solutions for cannabis extraction and refinement and natural products extraction and refinement. I've been in the cannabis industry legally for probably 8 or 9 years here in Canada. Eric and I have worked closely in the past. And yeah, looking forward to it.
Fantastic. My name is Eric Akbar. I'm the president at Cannabis Corp. We're a contract manufacturer that specializes in both extraction and packaging of dry cannabis. As Aaron said, we've worked with each other before, and as a contract manufacturer, obviously we get to see a fair bit of input materials and different processes. So I think it'd be a good opportunity to discuss some of our experiences and hopefully give you guys a guiding note to use that as your future path as you see different issues come up with your cultivars or your product that are going to be extracted.
Wonderful. Nice both to meet you, and I think we better just get right into it. So since the subject is contamination and remediation, let's start with Aaron. Can you explain remediation to the people of the audience that might not be familiar with the topic?
Sure. So actually, before this talk, I researched the dictionary definition of remediation, which is the process of improving or correcting a situation. I think in our case for this discussion, remediation is a process of removing an undesirable contaminant from your products. And when we say undesirable contaminant, we're referring to a physical, chemical, or biological unwanted thing in our product.
Yeah, that's and Eric, would you like to offer your insights? Same question.
I think Aaron really defined it right there.
It's that's a solid answer. Okay, well, now that we understand that remediation can cover quite a few things, can we give us some examples and how commonly is it used? So Eric, maybe you'd like to field this one to start.
Remediation is used in different forms, I guess. In a lot of what we deal with, it's the obvious ones that people are having challenges with, such as pesticides, heavy metals, microbial, and sometimes more physical qualities, such as color or smells and other characteristics that might be present in extracts that we try to remediate. So the different processes to deal with those, some worth it, some not, and hopefully today in the questions we can address some of them.
Right on. Aaron, do you have anything specific more along the lines of your background, perhaps with supercritical CO2 that is slightly different from Eric's answer, or would you say it's about the same on the same wavelength?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on the same page. The contaminants can vary, and they can vary from the source. And when we're talking about remediation methods, I think it really depends on where it is in your process, and what the contaminant is that you're looking at.
Right on. So, well, we've talked a lot about the idea of remediation and some examples, but now I think I'd like to know, well, there's, as you mentioned, there's many different types of contaminants. Can we maybe get into the main sources of those contamination, and maybe from your experience, what you've seen are the most common sources of contamination? And Aaron, I'll throw this one to you to start.
Sure. I guess it depends on what perspective you're looking at it from. if you're looking at it from a cultivator's perspective, your sources of contamination are going to be a lot different than if you're looking at it from an extractor's perspective or, say, a packager's perspective. If we're talking about an extractor's perspective, we can look at the input material, so the feedstock that you're using. You can look at the equipment that you're using, the materials of construction of that equipment, the reagents used in the process, so whether that's solvents or acids or bases, the cleaning agents you're using to clean your equipment. Sometimes the ingredients can introduce contaminants in your process. What else? Eric?
I mean, the other side of contamination that's fairly common is obviously microbial. And that can happen at many different stages. It could be in storage, it could be during cultivation, post-cultivation, and I think that's one of the most common ones that we see and successfully deal with. But then there's a lot of the physical stuff. I mean, Aaron, you're not seeing it. Older material that may have degraded will tend to have certain characteristics that are not really foreign, but just through the process of degradation or just handling that we try to remediate as well.
Yeah, and Eric, you and I were chatting yesterday a little bit, but these contaminants might not be, say, restricted by Health Canada. It might be something that causes poor flavor or smell in your products. It might be something that contaminates your equipment and causes your equipment to fail, but that it might it might not, what's the word I'm looking for? It might not be restricted by Health Canada. It might not be a pesticide. It might not be one of those. So, just important to keep that in mind.
I think that's a very important point. A lot of times we think of the rules and regulations being strictly set by Health Canada, and that's it. And you forget that maybe the processor themselves, or maybe even the customer, has a specific desired output. And to get to that particular output, the processor needs to take into consideration, yes, let's remediate things that Health Canada doesn't want, but we also have some things that we'd like not to show up, and there's steps to handle that. And I like this because it segs nicely into our next question. This is an interesting one. I'm curious to hear your answers on it. What in your mind is there any truth to the idea that some extraction techniques, methodologies destroy and or remove contaminants, making them less of a concern from a quality control perspective? Eric, if you'd want to jump on that one.
Sure. Certain methods, obviously, in our facility, we use CO2 and a combination of CO2 and ethanol in our processes. So the simple ones that we've very successfully and routinely remediated microbial. So yeast, mold, those types of things tend to be very quickly dealt with between temperatures, pressures, even obviously large exposure to ethanol. And that's one that, again, we readily handle. There are others that are obviously more difficult to deal with, such as pesticides and heavy metals. And in that, anecdotally speaking, certain processes may be, they all will extract the contaminants, but I believe they'll pull it at different rates. And obviously, Aaron can answer that more scientifically. I find ethanol, with the strength and its efficiency of extraction, also tends to pull a lot more of those contaminants and concentrate them. But at that same issue being said, I mean, supercritical CO2 with long exposures can have the same effect. And I don't think at this stage, with just the sheer number of pesticides that we have to obviously account for, and even with the short list of heavy metals, there's really a magic wand or a perfect process to extract it, to bypass those. But depending on where the source of that contamination is and where it is within the product, certain ones are just kind of concentrated a little bit.
Absolutely. And Aaron, do you want to follow up on that one?
Yeah, I mean, like Eric said, it's like what is your contaminant? Is it physical? Is it biological? Is it chemical? You know, remediating a physical contaminant can be as simple as having a screen somewhere in your process that restricts that contaminant from getting through. If we're talking about extraction, you know, a lot of extraction solvents that we use are in themselves antimicrobial. So if we're looking at biological contamination, you know, anecdotally, I can say that a lot of the processes will eliminate that contamination. If you look at the literature side of things, they might tell you something different, that you can still, you know, see microbial load after exposing samples to supercritical CO2 or ethanol, for example. If you're looking at chemical contamination, it really depends on what the characteristics are of that contaminant. You know, the polarity of your contaminant, and then the characteristics of your extraction method. So if you're using a solvent, is your solvent compatible, or is, you know, does it want to extract the contaminant? Is the contaminant soluble in your solvent? Most cases it probably will be. It's important to note as well that contaminants can accumulate in equipment if your equipment isn't properly cleaned. One thing we haven't really touched on yet is, you know, maybe the active ingredients that you're extracting in one process, you don't want to extract them in another process. For example, THC and CBD. So perhaps if you're looking to extract hemp for CBD, perhaps THC is your enemy. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but
no, it's good. And actually, I was that last remark reminded me of something that was happening in the States not too long ago. There was a lot of work. A lot of people were selling THC remediated distillate sourced from a product that had THC, but because of the regulatory environment down there, they were seeking to remediate what a lot of people are actually looking for. And if I'm not mistaken, the regulations came along to say, look, we won't allow you to even handle this material, which we consider federally a controlled substance.
Right.
And it's just kind of a little bit funny if you understand what's going on there. Yeah, and you both talked about this as well. The nature, especially with respect to the solubility of the contaminant. Water solubility definitely affects the presence of such contaminant, especially with things like, you know, pesticides, which are designed often to be incorporated into sprays, and the easiest way to spray that is with water. If you're using, say, like an alcohol extraction, which has a great affinity for water, a lot of times you can see those kind of contaminants show up in your end product because of that affinity. Yeah. So let's jump on to the next question. We talked about how some may or may not destroy them, and why. What would you say are the pros and cons of, if you're a processor, do you go for the route of being an in-house producer, or do you go for the route of being strictly toll processing? And from a contamination / remediation perspective, are there any steps necessary in the quality control perspective to audit that input material versus that which you produce yourself? Eric, if you want to go on.
Yeah, I mean, we don't cultivate, so it's not an issue for us. But dealing with our customers that are in both ends of that spectrum, some that are producing in-house, and we do some of their extraction, and some that are outsourcing their product and bringing it in for us to extract and give them the final product. At the end of it, they each have their pros and cons. It's about whether you're going to focus on internal controls or external controls. So obviously, with internal controls, you'll have some better preventative measures by, for example, controlling what chemicals are being used, what media you're growing in, And you know, a lot of things that were kind of addressed as being benign have more recently become issues for people to realize, you know, media, materials, nutrients, all of these things can very easily introduce those contaminants that unfortunately are very, very difficult to, and in some cases not possible commercially to remove. But in absence of that, if you're going to source it in, I encourage the customers to have an audit process, a vendor qualification for our supplier qualification process, be able to understand where that material comes from, see what preventative measures they have, how they control, and obviously independent analytical testing for all of those contaminants is key in making sure that you know what you're getting into. If you have bigger concerns, one of the things Aaron and I were talking about is there are labs now that offer additional testing. So you may have product that passes at you know, a typical lab, but may have been borderline. Looking and getting a little bit deeper information is critical, and that might be labs that have more analytical capabilities to give you, you know, part per billion testing for certain things and lower detection limits. That being said, I think it's important when we look at those contaminants to look at a lab report that doesn't strictly give you pass fail. You want to see the limits, you want to see the numbers, and those are key parts to keep in mind. But despite popular belief, I mean, there's some misinformation in the market as well. A lot of people feel that, you know, for example, if they're producing a vape product or concentrate or an oil, that they're going to at the end have to test for pesticide testing. But the current regulation says that if the flower does properly meet that testing, that's where your testing stops. But again, there are situations where you may see certain pesticides that have, you know, bigger ramifications, bigger risks, and if you see even as borderlines as a best practice, you may choose to reject that input material. And that's where, again, being outsourced, you have the opportunity to reject it. With insource, you really have to kind of take on the risk and make sure that you don't introduce it, because at that point, there's no option of really rejecting it without experiencing the commercial impact.
Yeah, a very, very, very thorough answer. I appreciate your thoughts on that. Aaron, would you like to add something to the question?
Sure. Yeah, Eric touched on a lot of good points there. I won't comment on the cultivation side. I'm just going to comment on the processing side. I mean, number one, and Eric, this is the first thing you said, but audit your supplier. Yeah. Number two, make sure you get a C of A of the incoming material. Like Eric said, you know, by Health Canada requirements, you're required to have a C of A of the incoming flower, which is fine for extractors. If you're a packager, whoever you're purchasing your product from, they don't have to have a C of A of, say, the distillate or the crude extract that they're sending. But I would argue there's probably enough of that on the market that you should be able to request a C of A from your supplier of extracts before you package it. Because if you package it and it tests hot, then you're in the hole. You know, audit your supplier, but also audit the suppliers of your ingredients. So, for example, you know, if you're purchasing terpenes for flavoring, those can contain pesticides. So get a C of A from your supplier. Another thing Eric touched on was, you know, getting deeper into the lab analysis. If you have a C of A from your supplier for the feedstock, there's some labs that will offer an unvalidated trace analysis, where so if you know that your material is testing under the limit, they can use analysis that will detect smaller levels of pesticides than what the validated method would show. And that may just give you an idea of, you know, if it's in there, how much can you concentrate it, or perhaps you shouldn't buy that product in the first place. Yeah, that's all I'll say about it.
Between the two of you, I think that was a very, very detailed and thorough answer and dive into that. And you both brought up something which, once again, nicely leads into the next question because, and this was based on something that, when this news made the headlines, it kind of shook things up a little bit. And of course, I'm referring to the idea of lab shopping, hunting around, sending your flower to get and looking for the best possible result. And what the reports were about were coming back with high cannabinoid content. But of course, now the question turns to, do you think that there are people attempting the same thing, shopping around for favorable contaminant reports so that they can pass on something that maybe shouldn't be passed on? Aaron, if you want to go on with that one.
Look, here. Oh, sorry. Did you say Aaron or Eric?
Your names are very similar. I should point that out. Aaron, we'll go with Aaron for this one.
Look, I don't think it's as big of an issue here in Canada than it might be in the States. If you have product anywhere in your process chain from cultivation to vape pen, and it tests hot for any pesticide, you are required to report it to Health Canada. So, and labs will have slightly different results, just depending on their methods and their equipment. But yeah, I don't think we're seeing that here in Canada. If you do happen to test positive, perhaps it's worth retesting your product with another lab, but I don't see that as much of an issue in the Canadian market. Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
I always recommend people use reputable labs. If you're a processor, obviously, I encourage you to audit those labs, look at their validations, look at their methods. If you don't have somebody internally that can do that, reach out. There's a lot of great people out there that can help, go through that audit with you and make sure the labs that you're using are using the proper methods. When there is positive testing with pesticides and they're at the reportable limits to Health Canada, they're going to go out there. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the end of it or the lot is doomed. There will be opportunity for you to launch an OOS, an out of spec, and investigation. And you know what? It won't be the first time where a lab has had a contaminated run where they may have had something exposed from a previous run or potentially a mix-up in the preparation, but you will have an opportunity to validate and ensure that that test was done properly. But in terms of going out there and shopping for, labs that will report favorably on that, they would very quickly become known in the industry, and I think a lot of people would just avoid them. So I would definitely agree with Aaron that the practice is not common, if at all present, really in Canada for contaminant testing. And I think we've been very lucky. We've been using some great labs, and I haven't had any negative experiences for contaminants. Variation in cannabinoid testing, that's been obviously a struggle for a lot of people, and it's one of those areas where you can have in-house testing that can be used for release of product, and I think that's one of the areas where it kind of opens the realm of interpretation of what is a validated method and how well you went about doing it. How well are you conducting your tests? How well are your standards kept, and how well are they validated? And it's a lot of moving pieces with cannabinoids, but in terms of product safety and obviously with contaminants such as heavy metals and pesticides, I think the current labs are doing a very decent job.
Maybe one thing to add to that I was thinking of, Eric, when you were talking is, when you're testing for, we'll talk about pesticides, but when we're testing for pesticides, you have a limit that you're trying to stay under. With cannabinoids, you have a range and you're just looking for the highest number. So I don't think that really lends itself to lab shopping for contaminants.
Yeah, I was thinking about this from a more of an anecdotal, personal perspective. Is, you know, if someone came back to me and said, "Hey, you know, that flower you bought was actually 25% and not 27," I'd probably not sweat it as much if someone came back to me and said, "Hey, that flower you bought actually has too high results of mycotoxins, or that concentrate was, you know, there was way too high residual solvent in it." I would maybe my heart rate would raise a little bit faster hearing the latter than the former. So yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, we've talked about you know, some remediation processes. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about um, comparing extracts to one another. Are some extracts easier to remediate than others? For example, say, you know, a distillate versus a shatter, or a shatter versus a rosin, or a distillate versus a rosin. Do you have an opinion on the remediatability, if I can invent a word for a moment, uh, of such concentrates? Aaron, if you'd like to field that one to start.
Um, I guess it depends. You know, it depends where you are in the process and what your product is. I would argue that if you're trying to remediate a rosin by any chemical means, that it's not going to be a rosin anymore. um, you know, typically, I'll say this, that anything with terpenes in it is probably going to be harder to remediate than anything without terpenes in it, because terpenes are often soluble with a lot of, at least from the pesticide perspective, a lot of the pesticides that we're looking at. We haven't really touched too much on biological contaminant or heavy metal or aflatoxin contaminant. And I haven't seen too many cases of those in extracts, but they are there. I'm going to leave it at that for now, and maybe I can comment more after Eric is done.
Certainly. Well, over to you,
Yeah,
Aaron. Eric.
I agree. Anything that's so rosin, especially if you're talking about live rosin or anything that's being processed with water. Generally, water extraction has high microbial risk. Water is, it is your enemy in trying to keep that risk out. Versus the other methods that whether you're using a hydrocarbon or using CO2 or ethanol or any combination of those, there's multiple kill steps that are going to prevent that. And that being also said, I do agree with Aaron that if you're talking about a solventless product and then you introduce the solvent, it's no longer there. But in terms of having seen the microbial contamination, I can say that anecdotally in the few hundred lots, I think it's still 500 lots of extracted lots and products, we haven't seen any microbial in any other distillate or shatters. We do not have a solventless extraction process yet, but I do know others have had challenges with those, and that really comes down to the quality of your input, making sure you ensure there isn't a problem to begin with, where you're not worried about carrying that problem on. I would say that in terms of remediation, the biggest thing that we look at as a processor is whether or not it's worth remediating, and that then it becomes also a dollar amount. You know, is the material you're going to recover going to have a commercial market at the price to be able to cover the cost of remediation? And I think recently with the price compression we've seen, that's an even bigger discussion than methodology or process or any of those stuff.
Yeah, I mean, is it worth it? Maybe it's worth it if you grow 200 acres and you have 200 acres of product to process and it's all contaminated with one thing. But as a toll processor, I'd say it's better to spend your energy making sure that the product isn't contaminated when it comes into your building.
Right. Actually, you guys kind of echoed my thoughts on this. Is, you know, if you have so many steps to get to a final product, every extra step that you're adding is just increasing cost. And this in a market that's already very competitive and very saturated. You don't want to be the only person out there with, maybe a $30 gram of shatter versus a $25 gram of shatter just because it had to go through an extra filtration step, when you as a processor could simply turn around and say, listen, I've got my hands full over here. Come back to me with something that isn't contaminated with something that's going to take effort to remove. And yeah, those are very good points from both of you. So actually, I don't know how we keep doing this, but every time you guys are almost have premonition for the following question with your answers, because they lead up so nicely to the next question, which is, so if remediation is difficult or relatively difficult and adds extra cost, it would make sense that then mitigation prevention is the best approach. Can we talk about some of the best practices? I know we've sort of touched on this in some of your answers already, but can we talk about some of the best practices that companies can follow to avoid these such contaminants? Whichever one of you would like to, if you've got an answer right off the top of your head, feel free to jump in.
Spec sheet. That's if you know what you're going to process, you know what your end product is going to be. Create a spec sheet for that, and that specification sheet is going to dictate what are your allowable limits for different things. What are you willing to accept and what are you not? So, for example, you may turn around and say, I will accept, yeast, mold, but I will not accept E. coli or salmonella. And in a certain facility, for example, if you have, no exposure to dried cannabis, where, you don't have all of your product going through extraction. If you're in a situation where you can have the proper PPE for your staff to be able to handle material like that, you could choose to say, I will take on the risk of handling E. coli or salmonella. But for example, in our facility, because we handle both flower product, dry good products, as well as that, we would not want any chance of those items obviously coming in contact, so we wouldn't accept it. Again, if your extraction process shares shares your pre-processing, where you may handle solventless products as well as products that you're going to put through this, again, those would all create different requirements, and that specification sheet will speak to, we will tolerate this much in mold use, we will tolerate this much. Whether you may say, I want non-detect for heavy metals, or you may say I'm willing to accept small traces. So when we start to look at those and clearly setting those as standards, makes it easier both for your staff to determine whether or not that product's acceptable, but also externally, if you're going to source your material, to be able to share that with your partners and say, these are our specifications, and they can look against their product and know whether or not it meets it or not.
Right on. Aaron, would you like to follow up with that one?
Yeah, I guess, at a really high level, develop your preventative control plan. So understand the process and ensure the right people are involved in putting those documents together. Understand the hazards to your products, the preventative controls, and ensure your plan is up to date with your process. Ensure that your employees have proper training, that people are following SOPs, and that you have good record keeping of everything. That's like the diplomatic answer.
Record keeping really can't be understated.
Yeah.
Paperwork for days. Yeah. Okay. Now I've got an interesting one, and it's kind of related to what we're doing here, because this is a panel based around educating people. What more do you think could be done in the industry to get this kind of information out there to the average consumer, to make them more aware of contaminants in general, and B, the processes that people, or specifically your company, does with respect to mitigating and remediating these contaminants? Eric, I'll jump to you to start.
I think they're very misunderstood by consumers. One of the things I've always been a proponent of is the transparency and letting people know what they're dealing with. The challenge also is when we talk about contaminants, a big part of understanding what the limits or the acceptable limits for those are is mode of consumption. So, you know, if you have an ingestible, you're going to have a different interaction. Again, a lot of these materials, a lot of these, you know, restricted contaminants and limits that we set for them are present in our standard food production. And it's stuff that we don't see, we don't touch, but it's a part of our lives. We consume it because, you know, one of the, you know, standards, whether it's USP or EU, have come to an understanding that for an ingestible, this is an acceptable limit. But when we start talking about cannabis and you know, some of the products that we produce could either go to ingestible or inhalables, and that's where you want to hold yourself to the higher standard and make sure it's there. But talking to consumers and understanding what the risks are, that's very important. I think a lot of people underestimate where the other risks to that contaminants are. Hardware. I mean, we've seen this in the past in the U.S. and you know, where we had, for example, vape carts that had heavy metal risk. And, you know, yes, you tested your product, you had a clean product, but the manufacturing of the hardware that you used was not to the same spec. And now you're introducing that in the post process, in the packaging space. So, you know, using equipment that potentially have contact with things that are, you know, potentially adding more of those chemical risks or metal risks, and the consumer has to be able to understand and decipher all of this. Not all of them are going to understand what these pesticides are, what these heavy metals are. We all say that, you know, we're passing Health Canada checks, but it would be nice to kind of start to see maybe a body out there that looks for more consumer protection and does some independent testing. You know, much like you would see with toys, you know, the toy comes out and there's always a body to kind of take that and do further testing and say, you know, does it really meet the safety for your children? And maybe, you know, share some of that information with people from a more agnostic perspective, as opposed to the producer, you know, claiming that they've used the third-party testing and everything is good. To that same note, though, there are a lot of items here that we test for and that we handle that, you know, may not necessarily be relevant to cannabis. And I'll let people kind of, I guess, have their opinions on it. But I know Aaron and I, for example, we're talking, it's like, have you ever seen the aflatoxin positive test? And like, I haven't. Let me go and ask. And I ended up asking a few of our quality people that have all worked, you know, some of the early days of cannabis, and none of us have ever seen it. So is it good to still test for it? I'm not saying not to, but you know, you get to a point where you have to ask, okay, how and why we test for things, and having a better understanding of, you know, hey, if we know in distillate form we don't have a microbial risk, then maybe the testing should be done at a later stage, and understanding that maybe the final products are really the golden standard to do all that testing and make sure that everything meets the standards for the consumer, which we do, but in process have a better flexibility of targeting those products for different markets.
Yeah. And Aaron, would you like to throw on some stuff on the end of there, or how do you feel about that one?
I mean, it's important for consumers to understand that the products are safe and that they meet certain safety requirements that are set out by Health Canada. And those requirements are rigorous, as Eric can certainly attest to. That's about all I can say about that.
It's perfect. It's short and sweet and gets right to it. Especially, I think it's important for people to have faith in the system that was created to protect them. And I know that sometimes that can be a little hard for people to wrap their heads around. So the more that can be done to bridge the gap between what is sometimes kind of heady stuff and stuff that's really just there for people's protection is important to do. Well, with that said, I'd like to thank both of you for being here and sharing the wealth of information that is stored up here in your heads. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to both of you and engage. And I'd like to say thank you to everyone that was here to witness and listen and tune in. This is Imran Rashid with Aaron Godin and Eric Akbar. Take care, and we'll see you in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.